Welcome to today's news briefing on the redistricting battle in Harris County, Texas. How boundaries get drawn determines whether a community's voice gets heard. I'm Pilar Barrero, Associate Editor of Ethnic Media Services and your moderator for today. A special thanks to our co-host, Houston in Action, to Mi Familia Vota, and the Texas Civil Rights Project for their help in planning today's event. Our speakers will explore what redistricting is, why it has traditionally discriminated against communities of color and low-income neighborhoods, and what activists are doing now to make the process more fair. My husband and I were alone in the house, and we were awake all night, just awaiting whatever would happen.
Como eso de las 5 de la mañana, yo escuchaba las sirenas, los helicópteros y mucho ruido que empecé a entrar en pánico.
About 5 in the morning, I started hearing the sirens and the alarms, and I started to panic.
Le dije a mi esposo, tenemos que irnos de aquí de nuestra casa, y él no quería.
I told my husband we had to leave, and he didn't want to.
Agarramos nuestras pertenencias como la licencia, un poco de dinero, lo pusimos en una Ziploc baggie y salimos a pedir ayuda.
Finally, we got our license, a little bit of money in a Ziploc bag, and we just took off.
Cuando salimos a la calle aquí principal, que es la Richland, donde nosotros vivimos, ya la calle parecía como un arroyo, un río, no sé ni qué decirles, con aguas sucias, feas, donde la corriente nos regresaba para atrás.
When we went out on the street where we live, the street was a river, but the water was nasty, it was dirty, and it pushed back against us, keeping us from moving forward.
So I'm going to talk to you about what is redistricting. And this is a map you'll recognize of Harris County. This is just an example. I'm not going to talk about this map, but this is just an example of a redistricting map. And in its most basic form, redistricting is just about drawing lines on a map to represent who is going to vote for certain elected officials. And neighborhoods are grouped together into these types of districts, essentially to create groups of voters, I guess is the best way to put it, right? And how these lines go on the map is a very political act. It's a very political process, and one that's very important to get involved in. So I always like to start with the idea that we live in communities. I'm sitting in Houston right now. This is a few blocks from my house. And this is a type of community that we might live in if we have a place to live in Harris County. There are other types of examples of communities that we live in. Some of us live in suburbs. Some of us live in the city. Some of us live in some of the outer areas, like Myrtala does, outside of the city. And all of these areas, all of these neighborhoods are grouped together into districts. And from time to time, those district boundaries are redrawn. And we're going into a process right now following the census where the district boundaries are redrawn. We have to look at the political lines as we begin to redraw and say to ourselves, how can these political boundaries be most fair given what our neighborhoods look like today?
It goes directly to the heart of where you do not have to be a citizen or a registered voter in order to participate in redistricting, right? So last year, OCA-Greater Houston, along with other community organizations, we focused very much every 10 years on the census. This immediate past census is the third census that I've been working on, of just me personally, with OCA-Greater Houston. And the reason is because we wanted to make sure everybody got counted, right? So we went and dropped, 221,000 doors, and regardless of whether or not they were, Asian or African-American or Latino, whoever, we just wanted everyone to get counted because we were focusing on immigrant communities in apartment complexes, which are oftentimes forgotten or, just really just invisible, right? Because they're considered, poor, they don't participate as much. And these are all these types of negative stereotypes. So I want to emphasize that, we did that because we wanted to make sure everyone got counted so that everyone is included when we're talking about redistricting, right? So when you filled out the census, it did not matter whether or not you were a citizen or a non-citizen. You existed as a living human being, you needed to get counted. And the same thing applies to redistricting, right? Everyone who is a living human being, gets counted for when these districts are formed. And I echo Nina, that you want to, be involved, not just at the state or congressional level, but to pay attention to the local level. Because that's when we're talking about who gets to spend the money that gets distributed down, then it really does come down to, are these districts, are they going to be fair and equitable? Are they fair, opportunity maps is the terms I like to use, where, if you look at the map that, Nina showed, if the district is majority one, group, and there's a minority of other groups, then do we really think that those groups who live in the minority are their needs going to be taken care of? And we can see this across just Houston, right? There are certain areas where there are no potholes. There are always streetlights that are on. There are sidewalks. And then there are, areas of this city that don't have that. We have open sewage, lines next, we call them ditches, but really they're open sewers, right? No piping. Why is that happening in certain areas versus another? It all comes back to, how is our money allocated and who is making the decision on how that money gets spent?
One thing that we have to be mindful of, like when it comes to like redistricting and drawing maps, that there's a thin line between wants and needs. So we have to be like drawing these maps. It's a tough job, because everybody want to carve the map out in a certain fashion that would, where they will be the beneficiaries of the votes or the voice of the people. When, to echo Debbie, like we really need to have inclusion and they really need to be equitable. So it's like, how do you do that? Voting, it really matters. Like our voices and opinions really matter. And if you're not involved in, like voter engagement, or like we only do the maps every 10 years. Many of you already know, but if you're not involved, or if your community, get involved and try to figure out how to carve out a map, from your area, your neighborhood, because, it's important that, we could bring equity to our elections. And that's pretty much all I have.
I found out that young people and people of my ethnic background, Hispanic people, oftentimes don't know the specific details behind what goes behind redistricting and census counting, but there is a care in the community. So for example, people might care about income inequality, they might care about the schools their children go to, and they might care about the construction projects that never quite get done in our communities, but they don't exactly make the connection between census counting and redistricting and all the reasons why our communities are the way they are. Oftentimes, when you speak to these kind of people who kind of don't see any hope in these activist movements, he saw no point in filling out the census. He saw no point in registering to vote, because there's this whole mentality of my vote doesn't matter, my count won't matter, my family won't matter in the grand scheme of things. And I found whenever I showed him articles or arguments of the series of events that lead to these kinds of community, lack of resources in our community, there wasn't a connect between what he saw in person and what he saw in the news. And I found that what actually helped people like him and just general people in my age group to care was to think about their families and the future of their communities. So in order to get people to care, you have to be a lot more realistic, and you have to go out and target these specific local communities in order to get people to see what the future is in redistricting.
Try to start off by saying that voting rights and redistricting essentially go hand in hand. You have voting happens within your electoral districts. Your electoral districts affect who you vote for, and so they go hand in hand. And voter suppression and gerrymandering have both been methods where elected officials have used them and weaponized them to maintain political power. And so access to the ballot box is just as important as fair redistricting. And I think if we see, and this is just kind of, I guess, like me thinking about what the landscape looks like in Texas, but if we see very aggressive attacks on access to the ballot and voting rights, we can expect the same aggression come redistricting this fall when the maps are actually being drawn.
I think that outreach was especially important in the census because that was one of those community projects where you didn't need to be a citizen in order to be counted. And now that we have these 2 new congressional seats in Texas, it's important to notice that a lot of that population, that extra population that helped us get that representation, was due to these immigrants that might not have the voice to go out and vote for those 2 extra seats. So I think it's important to kind of keep them in mind when making these districts and keep them in mind when we further our political agendas.
Thank you so much, Casandra. And I appreciate everyone being here to talk about this subject. And thank you for illuminating it for our media organizations.